All right, well, good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, so we will get started for the evening as more of your colleagues come in, I'm sure, over the next few minutes. But hope everyone is doing well. Hope your week is off to a good start. I also hope that everyone had a very good Labor Day last week. It is kind of strange. We're here for week number three. We kind of had that break last week because of Labor Day, so it's kind of may have broken our schedule up a little bit, but what we'll do tonight is go over some of the information that we would have covered last week, last Monday, and then we'll move into the week three information then a little bit later on tonight. But thank you very much for your posts in Canvas essay number 2. I think everyone did a very nice job of identifying those five peer-reviewed articles and providing citations for those articles. I was very happy. I went through and read all of your posts. All the grades should be posted for those essay responses. And again, I think everyone did a very nice job. All of the articles that were used came from peer-reviewed journals. And so it seems like you certainly all know how to find peer-reviewed journals and then find articles from those peer-reviewed journals that address the topic or the issue that you want to address. And so that was very reassuring to me because it looks like everyone already knows how to do all that type of research. So it will really truncate some of the information we're going to talk about in the first part of class tonight. So we don't have to spend as much time as I was anticipating talking about conducting research in public administration, because it seems like you all know how to do that quite well already. The only reason why I may have deducted a point or so on a response was because of APA formatting. And so what we'll also do in the first part of class here tonight is we'll also talk a little bit about APA formatting, and it's a little wonky, for lack of a better term. I'm not a huge fan of the way in which APA does their citations in the 7th edition of APA, especially the way in which they handle their article titles. And it's kind of strange in that you don't capitalize every single word in the article title. You capitalize the first word and then the first word after a colon, and those are the only words in the article title that you actually capitalize. And so again, it's a little weird to get used to, but we'll talk a little bit about APA formatting, and I'll show you a couple of really good resources where you can get perfect examples of how you cite articles and books and websites and personal communication and government documents in APA 7th edition. But we'll talk about that as part of our discussion of conducting research in public administration here in the very first part of class. And then once we are done with that, we'll then shift gears and move into our information for week number 3, which is to talk about the underpinnings of public administration in our system of American government. And we all know that in public administration, we are operating in public agencies, nonprofit organizations. But whether we're in public organizations or nonprofit organizations, we have a very strong linkage to governmental institutions. So our public organizations are created out of enabling legislation that will come out of a legislative body. Sometimes they'll be created out of executive orders that come from a chief executive's office. But the very existence of our organizations can be traced and tied directly back to governmental institutions. What we do on a daily basis is overseen by governmental institutions and elected officials. And so we have this very strong linkage of public administration and the political environment, the environment of American government. Even if you're in a nonprofit organization, you're probably providing support for programs and policies that, again, find their genesis in legislative organizations. And so we have this very strong linkage. So to understand public management, public administration, it's important that we understand the role that public administration plays in our system of American government. So we'll talk about that tonight as well. And I'm going to try and avoid making it kind of a political sciencey type of a class, but instead to really talk about some of where those governmental institutions came from and this linkage between American government and public administration. So that is our goal for this evening. Then coming up next for this Thursday, obviously, and then for your response posters as well, you have Canvas essay number 3. And in Canvas essay number 3, you'll take some of the information that we talk about here tonight about our American federal system, and you will talk about an issue and how that issue and the way in which that issue is being administered, how that is affected by having different levels of government, a national, state, and a local government. Most of the policies, most of the issues that we deal with in this country have intergovernmental elements to them. Oftentimes, our issues, our policies are indirectly administered by the national government and then directly administered by state and local governments. And so for that essay, you'll be just looking at how our system of American government and American federalism impacts kind of the issue that we deal with, whatever issue you select, that we're dealing with as public administrators. So again, kind of boil it down, how does American federalism impact our work in public administration? So that is where we are, and that's what we're going to be doing tonight. But again, because everyone did such a nice job on Canvas essay number 2, I think we can dispense with a lot of this preliminary information relatively quickly on how to conduct research in the field of public administration. Clearly, you all know how to locate these articles, and so we're not going to spend that much time on that aspect. But I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of peer review and why we in the discipline of public administration, as is true in many other academic disciplines, why we place such a value on peer review, why we use peer-reviewed articles. Most of the work that you do here in this program, you will be relying upon journal articles, articles out of these peer-reviewed journals. You'll use a lot more articles than you'll use books. That's really kind of where most of our information will be coming from throughout this entire program. So why do we use peer-reviewed journals? We use peer-reviewed journals because we want to make sure that the articles we are using obviously are valid, that they are credible, that the methodologies used in those articles make sense and are appropriate for answering the research questions that the articles are trying to answer. So when we're talking about a peer-reviewed process, we're talking about a journal that usually goes through what we call a double-blind refereed process, by which whenever a prospective author submits their manuscript to a journal, that manuscript is submitted anonymously. So basically what you'll do is there'll be no identifiers on that manuscript. And that manuscript that doesn't have any identifiers will not have the author's name, will not have the author's affiliation. When those manuscripts are submitted, they are submitted to the editor of the journal. The editor of the journal, once they receive these manuscripts, will first do an initial cursory look at the article to make sure that it fits within the scope of the journal. Now, there are literally hundreds upon hundreds of academic journals. Not every article will fit within the parameters of that journal. So, if I'm sending in an article that's looking at internet taxation, and I send that internet taxation article into Nature, obviously Nature, which is the premier journal in the social sciences, they're not going to have anything to do with that because it doesn't fit their mission, their charge as a journal. So if the editor thinks that this manuscript doesn't fit the mission of the journal, they'll just reach back out to the author and say, this doesn't really fit what we're doing as a journal. Perhaps here are some other journals you might want to think about sending your manuscript to. So they'll kind of do that initial kind of gatekeeping check as an editor. Once they have determined that, yes, this article fits within the mission of this journal, then they will assign that article to a panel of referees, a panel of reviewers. And typically there'll be either 3 or 5 reviewers who will be selected to review this manuscript. And again, they'll be doing it on an anonymous basis. And I've served as a reviewer for several different journals. I've done it for Publius, the Journal of Federalism, Teaching Public Administration, Journal of Public Affairs, Education, State and Local Government Review, and the process is always the same. And so as a reviewer, an editor will reach out and say, do you have the time to review this article? And then they'll give me, just kind of the title of the article and then the abstract of what the article is about. If I agree to review that article, then I'll get the manuscript. And then I'm reviewing that manuscript to see if the research question makes sense, to see if the methodology that the author used is adequate for answering that research question, to make sure that they collected their data in a methodologically sound manner, to make sure that the statistical analysis that they applied to their data, that analysis was appropriate for what they're trying to accomplish. And so, one of the common things I oftentimes see is when I'm looking through a manuscript, I'll see the author has a dichotomous dependent variable. So their dependent variable is either something happened or it did not happen, kind of that yes, no type of dependent variable. But then they'll use something like Poisson regression, and that just doesn't fit a dichotomous dependent variable. Or a dichotomous dependent variable, they're going to want to use something more like logistic regression, binary logistic regression. So that would be kind of a fatal flaw of their methodology. And so I would identify that, and then I would provide my comments back to the editor. Usually also, as you're providing your comments, your observations about the manuscript back to the editor, editors will then also ask reviewers to give their preliminary decision about whether or not this article is ready to be published in the journal. And there are usually 3 different recommendations that reviewers will make. Either publish the article as is. That is extremely rare. That happens very rarely. I think, I'm in year 29 of doing this, and in 29 years, I think I've gotten 2 decisions that were published as is. It just doesn't happen very often. The much more common recommendation that editors will receive from reviewers is a R&R, otherwise known as a revise and resubmit. So the article fits the journal parameters, the methodology is sound, the research questions sound, but there are some revisions that could be made or should be made before this manuscript gets published. So a very common type of recommendation that I might make is I look at the methodology the author is using, and if I see that there are some independent variables that the author did not consider that are important variables that should be considered, that would be one of my recommendations, is that they considered some important variables, but here's another variable that could have an impact upon the dependent variable that should be considered. If authors don't consider all of the important relevant variables, they are committing a type of error known as specification error. Specification error occurs when a researcher does not consider all the important variables in their analysis. So I would say I would recommend that you consider this additional variable and include this variable into your analysis. So that would be a revise and resubmit. The third decision that a reviewer can not really make, but recommendation that they can make to the editor is this article should not be published. It's kind of beyond repair. There really aren't enough revisions that can be done in order to salvage this article, and so it just should be rejected. So the editor will get those decisions and those comments back from the panel of usually 3 reviewers, and will then communicate that information back to the author. And again, usually it's going to be a revise and resubmit type of decision. Then they'll put a timeline on that. They'll say, okay, here are all the comments from the reviewers. If you choose to go ahead with the revise and resubmit, all of your revisions must be completed by this date. It's usually within about 30 to 60 days. And then you can resubmit. And when you resubmit that manuscript, you must clearly delineate, here are all the changes that I made. Here are all my revisions that then are responsive to these comments from the reviewers. So you have to show very clearly, I did this, and this is how I responded to this comment. I did this, and this is how I addressed this comment. Sometimes a revise and resubmit can be very simple. The last article I did this year was a very simple revise and resubmit. I was able to get it done within a week, and then the article got published. But sometimes revise and resubmit can be very much of an iterative process, in that you revise and resubmit, then you get a notice back from the editor once the reviewers have reviewed it and they want more changes. And so you make more changes. Then you resubmit it, and then you get a comment back that, well, we want these additional changes. I published an article years ago in Publius, the Journal of Federalism, which is a pretty rigorous review process. And I went through, I think, 3 or 4 different iterations of revisions before that article was published. It was about a 6 to 8 month process before the article actually came out in the journal. But again, going through this revise and resubmit process ensures that the article is of high enough quality, that the findings are credible, that the methodology is appropriate and valid. And so therefore, as a consumer of that article, you can really trust that article and you can then utilize that article in your research. So it's important that we go through that type of peer-reviewed process and we use articles from these types of peer-reviewed journals. Now, in the social sciences, as a reviewer, typically you don't get compensated for this. So I've never been compensated for being a reviewer on articles. Oftentimes you will get some compensation for reviewing textbooks, but for articles in the social sciences, you usually don't get compensation. Now, in the natural sciences, sometimes you do get compensation. And I mentioned before Nature, which is the top tier journal, the #1 journal in fields like microbiology, which my son's getting his PhD in microbiology. And the goal for all microbiologists is to eventually publish something in Nature. To publish an article in Nature, you also have to pay when you submit that manuscript for consideration. And then the amount of money you pay is then used to compensate the editor and compensate the reviewers. That's something that happens in the natural sciences, not really something that happens over here in the social sciences. Monica has a good question in text chat. Is there an appeal process for the author if they do not agree with the decision? Perhaps it gets sent to a different panel for review. Typically, if you don't agree with the recommended revisions, you can communicate that to the editor. The editor will then communicate that information back to the reviewers. Sometimes the reviewers will budge, and maybe a reviewer will be like, oh, okay, I see what the author is saying, and maybe I didn't really understand the direction of their research. And so sometimes they will kind of take a step back and accede to the wishes of the author. Usually there's not really a formal appeal type of process. Authors, if there are too many revisions or revisions they don't agree with, they'll oftentimes just withdraw their manuscript for consideration and take their manuscript then to another journal. I have done that on 1 or 2 occasions where I've gotten feedback, and the feedback has been, well, I've looked at feedback and said, this is going to completely ruin the entire research. They don't understand what we're doing in this research, and so therefore we're going to go to a different journal that understands it a little bit better. But from an ethical perspective, if you are going to do that, you must tell the editor, I am withdrawing my manuscript from consideration before you submit it to another journal for consideration. You should only submit research to one journal at a time. And oftentimes in that little acknowledgement form that you fill out when you submit your manuscript, you'll have to attest to the fact that this manuscript is not under consideration by any other journal at this point in time, because journals don't want to be kind of in competition with each other for the same manuscript from the same author. So that's a really good question. So as consumers of research, how do we determine if a journal is a true peer-reviewed journal? Because there are literally hundreds of journals out there that are peer-reviewed journals. So how do we locate these peer-reviewed journals? Well, clearly you all know how to do that because you all located peer-reviewed journals for Canvas essay number 2. You know that the CSUN library, their OneSearch function has a filter on the left side of the screen where you can click peer-reviewed journals only, and then OneSearch will only search for your topic in peer-reviewed journals. Now, if you're still not convinced that it's a true peer-reviewed journal, or you want to know more about how their refereed process works, and if it truly is a double-blind refereed process, you can then also go to the journal publisher's website. So when you look at the citation information for an article, you'll see here is the publisher. You can then go directly to that publisher's website. And then the publisher on the website will have manuscript submission guidelines for potential authors. In those manuscript submission guidelines, they will very clearly tell potential authors, here is what our review process is all about. Here is how you go through the review process. And that's how you then know for sure that, yes, this journal is indeed a peer-reviewed journal. But like I said, there are literally hundreds of peer-reviewed journals. And so the next question is, okay, I'm working with a peer-reviewed journal, but I want to know how high quality this peer-reviewed journal is. And so there are a lot of different metrics that can be used to kind of assess the relative quality of different peer-reviewed journals. One of those metrics that's most commonly relied upon is what's referred to as the impact factor for that journal. So every journal will have an impact factor. The impact factor is just a very simple calculation whereby you will take, well, you won't, but an organization like the Organization on International Research will look at we'll look at a 2-year period of time for a journal. So say, let's look at all the articles that were published in this journal over the period of time from 2021 to 2022. So they'll look at all the articles published in that 2-year period of time, and they'll look at the number of times those articles were cited by other people. So, and you can see this on a journal that you're looking up in the database. You can see it'll tell you cited by, and then the number of times it's been cited. So, if you see it cited by 13, it means 13 people have found that research useful enough and important enough to actually cite it in their own research. So how many times have these articles in this journal over this 2-year period of time, how many times have they been cited by other people? Divided by the number of articles that have been published in the journal over that 2-year period of time. So basically the impact factor is just kind of, and there's a little more to it, but it just kind of simply looks at the average number of times an article has been cited that was published in this journal over that 2-year period of time. Obviously, the more an article is being cited, the more high profile that journal is, the more people are reaching out to that journal and reviewing research published in that journal, the more important the research is that's found in that journal. So the rule of thumb is the higher the impact factor, the more prestige, if you will, that journal has in the field. And so I've got a link that I went ahead and added here to our slides that will take you to an external website if it will work. I don't know if it's going to work. If not, then I'll stop the share and we'll try it another way. Okay. We've got to make sure that we are humans. Yes, we are human. Believe it or not. Okay. All right. Hopefully you are seeing the OOIR website. The OOIR is, I think I misspoke before, it's the Observatory of International Research. And so this is just one of those organizations that puts together these impact factors for journals. And they do it across a lot of different fields. And so these are their impact factors for journals in our field of public administration. So you'll see the granddaddy of them all is Public Administration Review. And I saw several people use articles out of Public Administration Review, otherwise known as PAR. That is, again, the top tier journal in the field of public administration. So this has an impact factor in the range of about 6.1. This is your top tier journal in public administration. Then you can see some of the other ones on there, Policy and Society, JPART, which is the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory. I've done a couple reviews for JPART as well. That's a very good journal with a high impact factor. Public Management Review, Policy and Politics, Public Administration, the Review of Public Personnel Administration. Oh, you can't see it? All right, let me try this. Let me stop the share and then start it over again. Sometimes that happens whenever you are sharing out of a slide. It's annoying, but it does sometimes happen. Okay, let's just share it directly. All right. Can everyone see it now? All right, perfect. We'll just have to get out of the slide and get back into the slides as we go. So again, you can see all the journals here, PAR, the top one. Some of the others that I'll highlight for you are journals such as Policy Studies. And so if you're into public policy analysis, Policy Studies is a great journal. Policy Studies Journal is a great one. Policy Sciences, it's another great one in that field. If for some reason you're into accounting and public policy, you can see the Journal of Accounting and Public Policy. Public personnel management. I've done some reviews for PPM as well. That's a very good journal in the world of personnel management. And then one of the ones that's really rising, has been rising in the rankings over the past several years, is American Review of Public Administration. Seems like every single year their impact factor is getting better and better and better. They're publishing much higher quality articles. And so American Review of Public Administration is one that's a real riser in the field. And then you can just read through the rest of those on your own. This is just a selection of some of the journals in the field of public administration. So if you use an article out of a journal that's not on this list, that's absolutely fine. Perhaps the journal that you're using even has a higher impact factor than some of these on the list. Just because a journal has an impact factor of a 1.5 or 1.8 does not mean that it's not a good journal. Some of the newer journals that haven't been around for 60, 80 years, they may have some lower impact factors just because they are newer. And so people aren't citing information from there as much. But those journals, even though they are newer, can be very high quality journals and can have some very high quality articles in them. Also, pedagogical journals are not really on this list. And so if you're interested in public affairs education, JPEI, the Journal of Public Affairs Education, is probably the top tier journal in pedagogy, published by NASPA, the Network of Schools of Public Policy, Administration, and Affairs. That's a very good journal. The Teaching Public Administration is another good one in that area, published by SAGE. I mentioned before, if you're interested in political science, the Political Science Review, published by the American Political Science Association. If you're interested in federalism, the topic we're going to talk about tonight, then the journal Publius, the Journal of Federalism, is that top tier journal in that field, published by Oxford University. And I know it's weird, it's published by Oxford University about American federalism, but just kind of is what it is. So there are some really good journals that don't appear on this list. So I don't think that this list is a comprehensive list. It's just an illustrative list to kind of give you some examples of public administration journals and then where they sit in terms of their impact factors. But as long as you're using a journal that is peer-reviewed, that uses this blind refereed process, then you are in good shape utilizing that article. Yeah, there are a lot of different types of indices that can be used to look at the quality of journals. This impact factor is just the one that's used most commonly in the academic world. Can these other ones, as Susanna is asking, other metrics be used in conjunction with the impact factor? Absolutely. This is the impact factor is just one. There are a lot of other ones that can be used as well. And you'll notice when you go, and you can just go and Google this with the OOIR, and you'll see they not only give you the impact factor, but they give you a lot of these other measures as well. It's just kind of the impact factor is the most widely used one, and it's used across the most disciplines. And so that's where you're going to find articles from a lot of different disciplines having that type of impact factor. So it kind of allows you to kind of compare apples and apples, because if everyone's using the impact factor, then you kind of have the same type of methodology using to assess the quality of that journal. But again, the theme is that we're going to use articles that are from peer-reviewed journals so that we can trust those articles and we know that they've gone through this rigorous review process. So that's kind of how the peer-reviewed process works. We should be using articles out of those peer-reviewed journals. So when you actually go there to do your research, you're actually on the library website, you're actually finding these peer-reviewed journal articles. You know that there are a lot of public administration databases that are out there that are available to you to look through. Some of those I've linked on this. I won't go to it because I don't want to screw up our slides, but public administration databases, that heading is actually linked. And so it will give you a list of all of the databases that are available. There are dozens and dozens of databases there. Chances are you're not going to go directly to a database and search directly in that database. chances are you're going to use OneSearch or one of those kind of universal search engines, and then that will take you directly to the peer-reviewed articles that you are looking for. What I will click here, and so we'll have to get in and out, but I will click on this, and let me just see if this works. And I don't know, you probably can't see it. So let me go instead and stop our share and do a separate share here. And this link takes you to, you may have been here before and seen it, but will take you to the public administration page on the university library website. And so the university librarian who is responsible for public administration, you can see her right there, has put together this page for us that is very helpful for you to do research in the field of public administration. And so this is kind of your one-stop shopping here at this link. You have the box here if you want to use OneSearch, that's right there for you. There's also a video that the librarian has provided in terms of how to use OneSearch. You probably already used it for Canvas essay number 2, but that will give you a refresher on how to use OneSearch. Then on the right side of the screen, you'll see some search tips, some ways in which you can narrow or broaden your search depending upon what search terms you are using. And so this is where you can use the very famous Boolean search. And so in a Boolean search, you're going to use those connectors that I'm sure you've done before. So if you want to narrow your search down, so you want to look at a topic such as internet taxation, then you can search for internet and taxation. That will then produce for you any research, any articles that deal with both internet and taxation. So the words internet and taxation will appear in that article. So that will narrow your search down to only articles that have the term internet taxation in them. If you want to broaden out your search, then you can use a Boolean search such as or. So if you search internet or taxation, then that will return any articles that deal with the word internet, as well as any articles that deal with the word taxation, but they're not necessarily used together. So that would be a much broader type of search. That's why and is usually the most useful Boolean search you can do, because it will really narrow down your search. If you want to search for variations on a theme, so variations on a word, you can use the asterisk. And so, for instance, if you want to search for administration, but you want various derivations of administration. So you not just want administration, you want administrative, administrator, administration. You can do administrate and the asterisk, and then it'll give you all those different versions of the term administration. And so again, she's got just some really nice little tips here for you for how you can either broaden your search or how you can narrow your search using search terms such as and. And so just gives you a little bit of search help there. Then if you go over to the left side, then along this menu, you can see she has narrowed down some of the sources depending upon the topic. So if you're doing research in public sector management, here are some of the journals that are recommended in public service management, public sector management, things like PAR, the Public Administration Review, American Review of Public Administration, which we had mentioned before, JPART, which we had mentioned before as well, PAQ, which we haven't mentioned yet, but that's another very good resource, Review of Public Personnel Administration. And these are some of the big journals, peer-reviewed journals in the field of public administration. On the right side, then she's got some other things for, union links and links to think tanks. If you're doing work in public policy analysis, you've got things like the Policy Studies Journal, which we mentioned, Policy Sciences, which you mentioned as well, and Policy and Society. If you're into nonprofit management, Voluntas is one of the primary peer-reviewed journals in nonprofit management. One of my co-authors and colleagues does a lot of work in nonprofit management, and she very routinely publishes in Voluntas. Nonprofit Voluntary Sector Quarterly, Nonprofit Management and Leadership, and American Journal of Evaluation. GIS, if you're interested in geographic information systems, then here are some core resources you can use for GIS. And then along here, she's got Los Angeles, GIS information, California, United States, and international. So some really nice one-stop shopping for you. If you're into health administration, here are some of the major health journals: American Journal of Evaluation, Journal of Health and Human Services Administration, and so on and so on. Then she also has a link here for citation management. If you're going to be doing work in APA, you're going to be citing things in APA 7th edition. So she has a little quick guide here for you that you can click on. It's a PDF file to give you some examples of how things look in APA 7th edition. And then she has a sample student paper here that's in APA 7th edition. So you can actually see in the format of a paper how you do all these different APA citations. So it's just a really nice resource for doing research here in the field of public administration. I know most universities have kind of taken this approach where they have designated their librarians to service certain disciplines, and then they have put together these one-stop shopping websites for students in that discipline doing research in that field of study. So again, that's linked on there for you as well on our PowerPoint slides. And let me pull the slides back up. I think that might be the last time I have to get out of the slides, I hope. Let's see. Okay. So back into our slides, that link is an example of that one-stop shopping for research in the field of public administration. That just listed for you some of my favorite databases that I use for different types of things. For peer-reviewed articles, I tend to get a lot of my peer-reviewed articles out of JSTOR. You probably used JSTOR before, but JSTOR is a huge repository for academic articles. If it's published, there's probably a good chance that you can find it in JSTOR. ProQuest, you've probably used ProQuest before as well. That's a very useful one. What used to be the Public Affairs Information System, PAIS, that has kind of been subsumed within ProQuest, and so that can be gained access to by using the ProQuest database. Sometimes public administration abstracts can also be very helpful, that you can kind of narrow down your search by taking a look at the abstracts of the articles, and then you can narrow down to which articles you really need for your research. Which really, the word abstract really raises an important point. It's a really great search device for you. That, some of these academic articles can be very lengthy and somewhat laborious to go through. So if you want to make sure that an article really fits what you are doing research on, use the abstract. So every academic article will have an abstract. That abstract will usually be a 1 or 2 paragraph, depending on the formatting they use, synopsis of the article. So if you read the abstract, you can use that as kind of a screening device. So the title of the article may seem great and may seem right on point with what you need, but then when you read the abstract, you find out, well, no, it's kind of looking at a different aspect of this topic, something I'm not really interested in. And if so, then you can dispense with that. You don't have to go through and read that entire article. You can screen it out and save yourself some time and then move on to other articles that might fit your research topic a little bit better. So it's really important to use those abstracts as those screening tools. Now, again, you shouldn't use the abstract to substitute for actually reading the article. That's not what they're there for. They're there to kind of be a gatekeeper and let you know what the article is all about before you devote the time to reading through that article. And while we're talking about digesting articles, another important strategy to consider is that some articles can be very heavy on statistical analysis. One of the trends we have seen in the field of public administration, which I think is true across all the social sciences, is that research in the social sciences has really become much more empirical and quantitative over the years. If you want evidence of that, you could take a look at Public Administration Review articles from a month in 1973, for instance, and then compare that to the articles published in 2023. And you'll see there has been a huge shift away from more qualitative approaches toward more quantitative approaches. If you're reading an article in Public Administration Review, chances are there will be some statistical analysis and maybe even some heavy-duty statistical analysis. So if you're reading an article and there is statistical analysis that you are not familiar with in that article, It's an important skill to develop to learn how to glean the results of that article without necessarily getting bogged down into these statistics. You really hate to go out there and learn an entire new statistical method just to be able to use an article in your research. So typically, most academic articles will have a finding section, then they'll have a discussion or implication section, and then a conclusion. The finding and the discussions and implications section should give you some good holistic insight into what the authors found and why their findings are important for the topic and for the field without really getting overly bogged down in a lot of the statistical analysis, because articles are much more quantitative than they ever used to be in the past. But you're going to be relying primarily on these articles from these peer-reviewed journals. Um, there may be some occasions when you're using books as well. OneSearch is kind of your go-to for finding those books. You're not going to be relying upon books nearly as much as you're relying upon journal articles. In fact, in the program, you may have some instructors who will tell you, do not cite things from books. I only want to see citations from journal articles because I want to see contemporary current research. And that is understandable, but there are still some classic theories in public administration that we rely upon, whereby it could be necessary to cite a book. And so, for instance, if you are looking at decision making, and you're interested in how administrators or even how elected officials make decisions, and so you want to use John Kingdon and his famous work on decision making, you're going to be reaching back to a book from the 1970s. Well, sometimes that's okay because you need to cite this theory because it came directly from John Kingdon and his work in the 1970s. But for the most part, the research you're going to rely upon will be from these more contemporary, current, peer-reviewed journal articles. If you need to actually get a hold of databases, then data.gov, and we won't go there now, but data.gov will give you a wealth of databases of information collected at the national, the state, and the local level, city and county level. It's a great one-stop shopping for a lot of that information, data.gov. Public Affairs Index is another good database that can give you some entryway, if you will, into a lot of these data that are collected by governments. We know that at the federal level, we have the Census Bureau, we have the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They collect data every single day. They produce dozens and dozens of databases throughout any given year. Those are really good go-to points for information on things such as, CPI, Consumer Price Index, on costs associated with local governments, on local government employment statistics and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They provide a lot of that good information for you, and a lot of those databases can be found not only on data.gov, but also in the Public Affairs Index. We've already talked about using Boolean searches, using the ands or the ors if you want to narrow your research or if you want to broaden your research, using the asterisk to find different derivations of words. If you need a refresher on any of that, that page put together by the university librarian provides a lot of good insight on using those types of search devices. But the one thing that I saw that we probably could work a little bit on in the Canvas essays is the use of APA 7th edition. So APA 7th edition has been around for several years now, but 7th edition is, again, like I said, kind of wonky because it does some things that are a little counterintuitive to us in the way in which we probably always cited things going all the way back to junior high school and to high school. So just some basic parameters here of how APA 7th edition works. APA 7th edition uses parenthetical in-text citations. And so with these parenthetical in-text citations, they're relatively simple. So for most of your papers, you are going to not be using direct quotes, but rather you're going to be paraphrasing. And this is a very important point for academic writing. We are not that interested when we read your papers to see the use of a bunch of direct quotes. We want to see your interpretation of what you are reading. So we would rather see you paraphrase what you are reading than just replicate direct quotes. Now, every now and then a direct quote could be appropriate. So if you want to use a direct quote for emphasis, so there's some famous quote from Abraham Lincoln that really encapsulates the topic of your paper. You want to include that quote from Abraham Lincoln, the year in which he made that quote. That's okay. But for the most part, you're going to be paraphrasing information that you read. So for your parenthetical in-text citations for paraphrasing, it will be within parentheses, the last name of the author, comma, and then the year of publication. If you have multiple authors, then APA will have the last name, then comma, and the last name, and comma, and the last name, and comma. If you have more than 3 authors, then you're allowed to do the et al. And so the last name, comma, et al., and then the year of publication. That's for paraphrasing. If, however, you're doing direct quotes, then APA 7th edition requires page numbers. So if you're using a direct quote, be sure to use the page number. Does the article title need to be listed when quoting? No, not in your parenthetical in-text citation. Just the last name of the author and the year of publication. This is in the text. Now, when you get to your reference page, then yes, you'll have the full reference, the full citation, and in that full citation, you will have the article title included. But within the text, no, you do not have to include the name or the title of the article. That's a great question. Thank you. So direct quotes, you're going to want to use page numbers. Here's an example for short quotes. According to Jones, parentheses, 1998, comma, then in quotation, students often had difficulty using APA style, especially when it was the first time, close quote, and then in parentheses, the page number, page P period 199. So if there's one page, it's 1P. If there are multiple pages, then it's PP. So that PP stands for multiple pages. So you can see in the direct quote is pages 199 to 201, PP 199 to 201. There's one page, it's P 199. But as I said, use quotes sparingly. We're really looking more at paraphrasing your interpretation of what you're reading as opposed to just replicating a bunch of quotes from whatever source you are using. So how you cite different sources will depend upon the source. Here's a question Natalie asked: how do we know which words we are supposed to capitalize? In terms of when you do your citation in the article title, only the first word in the article title and then the first word after a colon will be capitalized in the article title. In the journal title, then you are capitalizing each word in the journal title. So if you're getting an article of the National Tax Journal, the journal title will be National Tax Journal, so it would be capital N, capital T, capital J, National Tax Journal. But in the article title, it's only the first word of the article, and then if there's a colon, then the first word after that colon. Because you know, academic writers like to use catchy titles, and so they'll have kind of a subtitle after the colon. That's kind of a fun little thing to do. I did a article in California Politics and Policy, I think it's now called the Journal of California Politics and Policy, looking at the secession effort, secession effort in the city of Los Angeles back in the 1990s. And so the title of the article was Secession in the City, and then colon, and then secession efforts in the San Fernando Valley. And so sometimes we use those colons to kind of have those catchy titles and subtitles. So here are some examples of how in your reference page you can cite different types of sources. So for journal articles, it's going to look like the author's last name, comma, and then the initials of the author. So first initial, period, middle initial, period, then comma, then for the second author, last name of the author, comma, first initial, period, second initial, period, and so on for all the authors that you have. And then in parentheses, the year of publication, then followed by a period, then the title of the article. And you'll see title is, the T is capitalized, but the A in article is not, because only the first word in the article title gets capitalized. then there's a period after the article title. Then journal titles in APA 7th will be in italics. So the title of the periodical, comma, and the volume number will be in italics. So journal titles are always in italics. Then parentheses, the issue number, because journals will have a volume and then they'll have an issue. So it might be volume number 40, issue number 2. Usually the way journals usually operate is that the volume is for all the articles that were published in that year. So, all the articles published in 2024 may be in volume 40, and then there could be maybe 4 different issues. One may come out in January, one in April, one in August, and one in December. Then those issue numbers are the actual ones, those actual 4 issues that came out in that year within volume 40. So the issue number is then in parentheses, comma, and then the pages for the article, what pages the article appeared in, the page range for the article. And then at the end, you see the DOI. The DOI is the document object identifier. I always get that wrong, but I think it's a document object identifier. Several years ago, what happens, they went back and they added document object identifiers, these unique numbers to every single publication. And so every publication, at least since 2000, should have DOIs. So whenever you get your citation, when you're in the database and you find your citation, there should be a DOI, a document object identifier, that needs to then be included as well in your citation for that journal article. All journal articles should have a DOI. If they don't have a DOI, you don't have to include it, but they should have a DOI. And so that kind of tells you the unique identification number for that journal article. If you are citing a book, last name of the author, comma, and the first and last initial of the author, in parentheses, the year of publication. And then since it's a book, there's no article title, there's just the book title. That then gets italicized, and the title, the first word in that book title is capitalized, and then the first letter of the word after the colon in the subtitle is capitalized as well. But the book title will be in italics in a similar way as which the journal title is in italics. Publisher name, whoever the publisher of that book is, and then the DOI. You don't have to worry about putting the city in there anymore. In the past, we had to put the city and colon, the publisher. You don't have to worry about putting the city in there anymore because publishers usually operate in multiple cities, maybe 5 or 6 different cities. So just the name of the publisher and then the DOI if it is available. Now, DOIs are going to be less available for books than they will be for journal articles. Journals have gone back through and they've added DOIs to their articles, but books are older, and so oftentimes books will not have a DOI. So don't worry about the DOI if there's not one for that book. If you're using information from a data set, last name, first initial, middle initial, or the name of the group that put that data set together, the year of publication in parentheses, then the title of the data set is in italics, version number, if there's a version number, and then in brackets, data set, to denote that, yes, this is a data set that you are using, that you are pulling information from, the publisher of that data set, and then either the DOI if it exists or the URL where you obtained that online. So the URL address that you got that data set from. More and more today, people are using citing information from websites. So it'd be the last name, first initial, middle initial, and then the year, month, and date that it was accessed, the title of the page, the name of the website, and then the URL address for that website. On occasion, in some of your classes, you will be using information that you obtain through personal communication with others. So if it's through personal communication, it would look like in parentheses, the name of the person, first initial, and then last name, comma, personal communication, to denote that it's personal communication, comma, and then the date at which that communication occurred. Now, again, most of your information is going to come peer-reviewed journal articles, and it's going to be that type of citation you see under journal articles. That's going to be the format that you are using. However, to make it a little bit easier for you, there are a lot of resources out there that will help you with APA formatting. I pointed out one to you on the librarian's website that is that quick start guide to using APA. The one that I really like a lot is the one from the online writing lab from Purdue University called Purdue OWL. And so let me take you there very quickly. And I'll stop this share and share it out directly if I have it. Let's see if it's disappeared. It looks like it's disappeared. So let me share my screen. Let me get out of here. End the show and get this minimized. And let me see if I still have Purdue OWL up here. I do. Okay. All right, hopefully you are seeing the Purdue OWL, the APA formatting and style guide. I've got this link in our slides. This is a really good, I always say one-stop shopping, but it's really good one-stop shopping for giving you examples of how to cite things in APA 7. So here is some information. Just click on these links for the basics on doing in-text citations. Again, it's going to be the parentheses, last name of the author, comma, and then the year of publication. How you do it if you have multiple authors in that link. Then when you put your reference page together, here are some examples of how you would do it on your reference page. And so what we're most interested in, articles and periodicals. So here are the examples I just pulled and put on our website in terms of how you would do it if it's an article that you're getting online. If it's in a print journal, this is what it would look like. If you are getting an electronic journal, this is what it would look like. See the addition here of the DOI. If you're getting it from a print journal, there's not a DOI. If you're getting it online from an electronic journal, then there will be a DOI for that academic article. As it tells you, there may not always be a DOI available. If you get something electronically, if it doesn't have a DOI, you can always include the URL address, and that will just help your reader then track it down. And you can see an example of that here. Articles and magazines, you're not be using that a whole heck of a lot, but that's how you would do it if it's in a magazine. If it's in the newspaper, that's how you would do it. If it's a review, that's how you would do it. And so it just kind of gives you some real life examples of this is what your citation should look like. Now, you're probably thinking that whenever I go ahead and do my search, that I can click on that citation and ask for the system to give me the citation in APA format. And yes, you can certainly do that. But even when it gives it to you in APA format, you still want to double check that. Because in my experience, even though I've said, give me the APA citation, sometimes that citation does not adhere completely to APA format. So you want to just review it yourself and make sure the system has given you something that truly adheres to APA. Julianne, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. I just had a quick question. I've had previous professors that want me when it has the link attached to it when you paste from the article during the citation, they want us to take the ability for you to click on it out. Do you want us to keep it? Do you know what I'm talking about? The
Yep.
hyperlink?
Yeah, I absolutely do. That's a good question. I don't really have a preference either way, and so I'm fine with either approach. But that's a great question. Yeah, I'm fine if it's an active link. I'm fine with that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, great question. Thank you. But again, I would really recommend that as you start writing your papers and as you put your reference page together to check out APA 7 because that's something that you're going to be using very frequently throughout most of your future classes. I am not a huge stickler on APA. I use APA. Most of the journals I submit articles to also use APA. It's really one of the most commonly used one in the social, it is the most commonly used one in the social sciences. Some of your instructors may be sticklers on APA and they may take off lots of points if you don't use APA correctly. I'm not going to do that. The only reason I took a point away on the Canvas essay is just so we could have this discussion about how APA works. And the most common mistake that I saw with APA in the Canvas essays was capitalizing each word in the article title and or not italicizing the journal title. Those are the kind of the two things that I noticed. I thought we probably should just address tonight so that moving forward, that's kind of part of APA formatting. But again, I was very impressed with the work that you did on Canvas SA2. Everyone had peer-reviewed journal articles. Some of the journals were more recognizable to me than others, but for those I didn't recognize, I pulled them and took a look at them. It seems like they all come from peer-reviewed journals, so you all know very well how to do this type of research. But one of the core elements of this class 610 is that because it's the first class for a lot of folks, is to make sure that you have those research skills. And so I'm very satisfied everyone has those skills. And that's why we were able to go through this information relatively quickly this evening. Okay. All righty, let's move onward and upward. We will take a break tonight, but it's a little early for a break. So let me just pull up the slides on American government and public administration. We can just get started on this information. This is our true week 3 information. And this information is what is going to then help you construct Canvas essay number 3, where you are talking about the influence of our American federal system on an issue that you have selected to use as the focus of your essay. Federalism really touches just about everything that we do in public administration. It's very rare that a policy or a program is implemented by one singular agency at one single level of government. Usually we have these networks, we have this collaboration between different levels of government. So it's important for us to understand where this system came from and how this system directly affects our work in public sector management. So kind of just to create a common foundation that we are all working from, kind of a similar reference point. I know that some people come into this program with a heavy-duty political science background. You're political science majors, you've been working in government for a while, so you have a really good sense of American government, its institutions, and how it works. For others, you may have come into this program from a variety of other academic disciplines, and so it may have been quite a while before since you've taken a civics or an American government course. So I think it's important for us to all kind of have the same basic understanding of American government and then what impact American governmental institutions will then have on public administration. So as you probably know, our system of government is predicated on the limitation of governmental power. That is this social contract theory that the framers adopted from John Locke and his second treatise on government. This idea that power comes from the people. And since power comes from the people, then the people decide what powers to then give to government. And then government enters into a contract with the people to then utilize these powers in a judicious manner in order to provide for the welfare of the public, the welfare of society. So we limit the power of government basically in 2 ways. One way we do it is horizontally through separation of powers. The other way is vertically through our system of American federalism. You are all very familiar with separation of powers, what Alexander Hamilton referred to in Federalist Paper number 28 as balancing ambition against ambition. So we balance the ambition of legislators with the ambition of the chief executive with the ambition of the judicial branch. So we have these 3 different branches of government in separation of powers. That very austere looking person in the middle of the screen is a president, that is President James K. Polk. I selected Polk to use as the example of the presidency because there's kind of an interesting corollary between the Polk administration and the current Biden administration, in that James K. Polk served 4 years as president and chose not to run for re-election. After his 4 years were over, he decided to go back to Nashville, Tennessee, felt that he had accomplished what he wanted to accomplish as president, and did not seek a second term. That is highly unusual for presidents. Presidents almost always seek re-election. But this year we saw President Biden decide not to seek re-election, perhaps for different reasons than James Polk decided. But it's kind of a nice corollary to what we are seeing today in the Biden administration. And I'm going to date myself a little bit and just reinforce to you that I'm an old guy. But if you're familiar with the band, They Might Be Giants, they have a song actually called James K. Polk. So if you want to learn more about James K. Polk, you can listen to that song by They Might Be Giants, and it gives you a little bit more insight into that president. That's why Polk is there representing the executive branch, representing the presidency. So we separate powers horizontally, and then we also separate powers vertically through our system of American federalism. Our system of federalism, constitutional federalism, only included two levels of government, the national government and state governments. Local governments are not included in the US Constitution. Any powers, any responsibilities, any assurances, if you will, that local governments have, they get from the state. They get from state constitutions and from state laws. This whole idea that local governments have no legal standing in the Constitution goes back to this adage known as Dillon's Rule. It came from an Iowa judge, and Judge Dillon promulgated this Dillon's Rule. And Dillon's Rule says local governments are creatures of the state, meaning that local governments are created by the state, they are empowered by the state. If they are created by the state and empowered by the state, then they can technically be destroyed and done away with by the state as well. And every now and then we see the state of California, the state legislature, talk about taking incorporated status away from certain cities because they lack population density or something along those lines. And so instead of being a city, convert them back into being an unincorporated area of the county. Whenever a city loses its incorporation status and becomes an unincorporated area of the county, it then falls under the auspices of the County Board of Supervisors. And so whichever supervisor that jurisdiction resides or lies within, then that supervisor is kind of the de facto head, the de facto mayor of that unincorporated area. And that's because of Dillon's Rule, because state governments create, empower, and may destroy local governments. But obviously the importance here is by balancing power horizontally as well as vertically, what the framers have done is they have set up a system here for us as public administrators whereby we serve what we call many masters. We have to serve a legislature in that we are empowered. Our organizations come about through enabling legislation through the legislature. The programs and policies we implement come about through enabling legislation through the legislature. So we serve the legislature. We are overseen, our actions are overseen by the legislature. But in public organizations, we are also then part of the executive branch. And so we are also then responsive to the chief executive, whether it be a president or a governor, we are responsive to that chief executive. And then our actions are also overseen by the judicial branch. And we know that the judiciary, in a variety of different ways, through things like structural remedies, writs of mandamus, sometimes consent decrees, will require certain actions be taken by public organizations and public administrators. So through this separation of powers, what has happened is there's been a fragmentation of power and a fragmentation of authority, which then has a major impact upon what we do and how we do it as public administrators. We also know that our system of government combines elements of a democracy as well as a republic. You know, there's that famous quote from Benjamin Franklin when he was asked, what type of government do we have? He said, we have a republic if you can keep it. So we are not a true direct democracy. We are an amalgam of democratic and republic principles. So we are a democratic republic, a constitutional republic. The amount of democracy that we see in our country will sometimes depend upon the state where you live. Some states have more aspects of direct democracy than other states do. We live here in the state of California. California has a lot of different elements of a direct democracy. There are a lot of opportunities for us to be able to participate in our own self-determination and participate in our own governance and our own making of legislation. So here in California, we have initiatives and we have referenda. So through initiatives, people can actually get signatures on a petition. They get enough signatures on that petition. That petition, those signatures are going to get validated by either the Secretary of State, if it's a statewide issue, or by Dean Logan's office here in Los Angeles County. And Dean Logan teaches in this program as well, just kind of as an aside. He's an adjunct professor in the program. But his office will then look over those signatures and make sure those signatures are valid. If enough valid signatures have been collected, then the issue can go directly on the ballot. So people through initiative process can force issues onto the ballot for them to then be voted on. A lot of the propositions that we see on our ballot in November will come to the ballot through this initiative type of a process. That's an element of direct democracy, allowing people to vote directly on these issues. Then we also have a referendum process. In a referendum, oftentimes, not always, but in a referendum process, the state legislature will decide this is an issue that we want the voters to decide. So rather than us deciding it here in the state legislature, we want to put it on the ballot and allow the voters to directly make a decision about this issue. So through the referendum process, you can also have issues being placed upon the ballot and then people voting directly on those issues. Here in California, we have both initiatives as well as referenda. In other states, there's not an initiative process. And so voters don't have the same mechanism for putting issues on the ballot. Even in other states where there is an initiative process, sometimes the standard for getting that initiative approved and placed on the ballot can be very, very high. Typically, what a state will do is a state will say, in order to put this issue on the ballot, you must collect a certain number of signatures. Oftentimes, that number of signatures will be the percentage of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election. So you have to get enough signatures equal to 8% of the number of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election. That's a relatively low standard for getting issues on the ballot. That's why whenever we go and vote in November, we see all these different propositions. Between now and November, we're going to keep seeing all these different commercials for Prop 33 and all these other propositions that we'll be voting on the ballot. In some other states, the standard to get an issue on the ballot is much higher, where it might have to be 20 or 25%. In some states, it has to be over 50% in order to get an issue onto the ballot. So in terms of direct democracy, we kind of differ depending upon states. And that's kind of the beauty and the curse of our system of American federalism. But we are also a republic, and the Constitution guarantees that every state will have a Republican form of government. And again, with these terms, we're talking lowercase r Republican, lowercase d Democratic. So every state must provide a Republican form of government, meaning that we elect people to go and make decisions for us. In DC, in LA City Hall, in Sacramento, we elect people to be our decision makers. So we kind of balance the two, a democracy and a republic in our system of government. So as a democratic republic, we have to have some limitations and parameters on what government can and cannot do. That is essentially the main element of this thing called social contract theory that I'm sure you all learned about in your American government courses. Social contract theory, according to John Locke and as adopted by Thomas Jefferson, said that people and their government enter into a contract. That contract is essentially the Constitution. The Constitution will then spell out the types of powers that people give up to their government, and then the extent of powers that government can use and how those governments can use those powers to provide for the welfare of society. Rousseau always told us that if a government violates the Constitution, if a government violates the social contract, that's not only the right, but is indeed the obligation of citizens to overthrow that government and to replace that government with a government that will abide by this contract, will abide by this Constitution. So we're a constitutional republic because everything that we do goes back to our Constitution. As public administrators, we are held accountable for knowing the constitutional rights of people we deal with and then endeavoring not to violate those constitutional rights. This is an example of qualified good faith immunity. Years ago, we had sovereign immunity, which meant if you work for a government, the government was sovereign, so therefore you were immune from prosecution. Today, we no longer have sovereign immunity, but the courts have given what is called qualified immunity. Qualified immunity says that if we are working within the parameters of our position, and we're working with the parameters of our job, and we are not violating constitutional rights of people we come into contact with, then we are immune from prosecution. But in order not to violate those constitutional rights, it is logical that we must first know what those constitutional rights are. And so that's why we're going to spend a little bit of time tonight talking about the Constitution, talking about the nature of this social contract that we must uphold in public administration. So as you know from your U.S. history courses, your American government courses, we are on our second Constitution. The first Constitution we had was the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation suffered from a lot of what were considered to be fatal flaws. The Articles of Confederation, as this first Constitution, called the Union of States a firm league of friendship. So basically what the states were doing in this Articles of Confederation is they were joining together into this firm league of friendship. Now, a league of friendship has a very transient, very temporary nature to it. That if you're in this league of friendship, if you're joining this league of friendship, then the implication is you can leave this league of friendship at any time that you want. And indeed, state delegates had the ability to leave Congress anytime they wanted to. So if a state didn't like what was going on in this Congress of the states, the meeting of the states, they could recall their delegates at any time. So a state could say, we're going to just pick up our marbles, we're going to go home, and we're not going to play anymore. That ability to recall your delegates at any time from this Congress of the states was certainly a weakness in terms of the strength of the national government. We also basically had a one-branch government. That one-branch government was the Congress of the states. We didn't really have an independent executive. We didn't have an independent president. The chief executive, the president, came from the Congress of the states. And so therefore, the president was more or less a figurehead. So, Samuel Huntington, when he was president, was a figurehead and had very little power, very little authority outside of the authority that was bestowed upon Congress. Also, when we talked about Congress in the Articles of Confederation, Congress was not envisioned as a permanent structure like it is today. We think about Congress today, we think about that picture on our first screen of Capitol Hill. That's not what Congress was referred to in the Articles of Confederation. The word Congress was used synonymous with the word meeting. So whenever the articles referred to a Congress of the states, it meant a meeting of the states. So it was a very temporary meeting of the states. Also, the only time the term United States of America was used in the Articles of Confederation as a proper noun, capital U, capital S, capital A, United States of America, was when the framers said, this is the name of the Union. So it said the style of this confederation shall be the United States of America proper noun. However, throughout the rest of the articles, whenever they refer to the United States, they said the United States in Congress assembled. So we were a government, we were a national government, we were a nation when the states were assembled in this meeting, this Congress of the states. And you notice that Congress was used as a synonymous term with a meeting. So when the states were not in this Congress, when the states were not meeting, you didn't have all the vestiges of a permanent national government. You didn't have a permanent legislature, you didn't have a permanent presidency, you didn't have a permanent judicial branch, you didn't have a permanent standing army or a standing navy, you didn't have an independent treasury, you didn't have any of these vestiges of a national government. This was truly a confederation. And when we think about a confederation, we think of an amalgam of individual sovereign entities that join together in this league of friendship for a given purpose. But they all retained their own sovereignty. It was very much of a confederation as opposed to the more federated type of government that we know today. And then another flaw in the Articles of Confederation is if they needed to be amended, the only way to amend the Articles was with a unanimous vote of all 13 states. We can imagine how difficult it was to get an agreement, a unanimous agreement of all the states to amend the Articles. In order to try and get that agreement, that unanimous agreement, we'd have to come together in this Constitutional Convention and then recommend amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And that was the initial goal of the Constitutional Convention, was simply to amend the Articles, not to throw it out and completely replace it with a brand new Constitution. However, in the lead up to the Constitutional Convention, there was this major triggering event that you probably learned about in your American history courses called Shays' Rebellion. Now, in our system of public policy making, typically, whenever we make major changes to public policies, we do that as the result of a huge triggering event. So something happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to change the way in which we are dealing with this policy. So you think about the September 11th as the perfect example of a triggering event. September 11th occurred. And as a response to September 11th, we ended up getting things like the Department of Homeland Security, the TSA, all these new regulations on airline travel, eventually the Real ID Act that we here in California, I guess, have until next May to get our real IDs if you have not done it yet. I haven't done it. I need to do that before May. That's all kind of a artifact of the events of September 11th. So these triggered events happened and then forced major changes to policy. Shays' Rebellion, or series of rebellions, one of them led by a retired Army captain named Daniel Shays, was that triggering event. So Daniel Shays led this group of farmers in rebellion because they were losing their farms. They weren't able to sell their crops. They weren't able to repay their bills, and they were being foreclosed on by banks. So they were losing their farms. They rebelled, led by Daniel Shays. And actually, there were multiple different rebellions that went on. We know about Shays' Rebellion. It kind of becomes the focusing triggering event just because it was led by a retired Army captain. But there are a series of these farmer rebellions, and they were all difficult to put down. And the difficulty in putting these rebellions of farmers down really galvanized public opinion around the idea we need to change the Articles of Confederation in order to strengthen national defense. If we have so much trouble putting down rebellions of farmers, what will happen when a major nation invades us? How will we repel that major foreign invasion? And that's a great example by Suzanne in text chat about Silent Spring and how that was a good triggering event, a good example of a triggering event that led to the beginning of the EPA and all these environmental regulations that we currently have. And that's a great example. Upton Sinclair's Jungle is another good literary example of a triggering event that led to a lot of workplace safety regulations that were then implemented by the national government. And so we do have a lot of those really good triggering events, really good examples of those triggering events. So as a result of Shays' Rebellion, these other farmers' rebellions, then when the delegates went into the Constitutional Convention, there was certainly an agreement that we needed to strengthen the Articles to create a stronger national government. However, when the convention started, not every delegate got to the convention at the same time. You think about roads then. And roads were sometimes impassable because you had a lot of rain, they turned into mud, you couldn't get your carriage through. And so it took you a while to get to the Constitutional Convention. Those who got to the Constitutional Convention first tended to be from a faction that came to be known as the Federalists. The Federalist faction believed that not only do we need a stronger national government for national defense, but we also need a stronger national government for things such as the regulation of the economy, to make sure that the national government could regulate currency and regulate trade with foreign nations and regulate trade among the states. And so Federalists really want to see a much stronger national government than what had been provided under the Articles of Confederation. The faction that opposed the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists, many of them got there after the Federalists, but the Anti-Federalists only wanted to amend the Articles and were only willing to admit that they wanted to get more national defense out of the new national government, and that's as far as they were willing to go. But people like James Madison, who at that time was a Federalist, later on, when he became part of the Jefferson administration, he then became an Anti-Federalist and started to become a very strong advocate for states' rights. But at this point in time, in the Constitutional Convention, he was in the Federalist faction, along with people like Alexander Hamilton and others. They believed in a much stronger national government. They got there first, and Madison was one of the major movers and shakers of the convention to really get the ball rolling toward replacing the Articles with a brand new constitution. And there was a very famous historical work that was written by a person named Charles Beard. And Charles Beard wrote this book that was called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And in the economic interpretation of the Constitution, Beard argued that the framers were at that Constitutional Convention to represent their own rational economic self-interest. That when you think about the delegates at the convention, they all shared similar characteristics. They were all white, they were all male, and they were all property owners, because in order to vote at that time, you had to be white, male, and property owner. So they fit a certain demographic profile. They were the more affluent residents. They were the creditors. They were the people who loaned the money to make the Revolutionary War possible. They were still waiting to get their money repaid. So Beard argues that they were there representing their economic self-interest. They wanted to get their money back. And that really kind of fashioned some of the elements that eventually came about in the Constitution. Beard's book and his thesis, they were very controversial in the world of history. And a lot of historians pushed back on Beard's thesis and said, no, they were there for altruistic reasons. They weren't there for their own economic self-interest. Where the field of history kind of came to an agreement is that there certainly was an economic self-interest factor that was involved with the delegates, but the delegates were oftentimes there not just for their individual economic self-interest, but for the interests of their states. They were there representing the economic interests of their states. James Madison knew that those delegates, those anti-federalists, really had these economic interests in mind. And so he knew if he could press that nerve, he would be able to get them to admit they wanted more out of the new national government than just national defense. And Madison was very skillful at pressing that nerve. Once he got some of those anti-federalists to agree, they wanted a stronger national government, not just for national defense, but also for the economy and to help regulate the economy. It was game over. And then the Articles were then thrown out and replaced with this new Constitution. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about the Constitution, but we are bumping up against 7:30. So I think it's probably a good time for us to take a break for the evening. So let's take a break until, let's say, 7:45. Come on back at 7:45, and we will talk about the Constitution and some of the compromises that were built into the Constitution that we as public administrators are still grappling with and dealing with today. And I'll introduce you to the three major conflicts at the Constitutional Convention, and then talk about how those conflicts were rectified, if you will, through creating a constitution that was really very much a series of compromises, and then how having a constitution full of a series of compromises has led to a lot of interpretation of what the framers actually meant with the Constitution. So go ahead and take a break, come back at 7:45, and we'll get into a discussion of those compromises in the Constitution, and then we'll move into discussion of American federalism and what it means for public administration. So I will see you back in about 15 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. It's 7:45, so we will get back into it and finish up our discussion of the Constitution. Now, as we had said, the Constitution comes out of the Constitutional Convention, and one of the reasons why we ended up with this Constitution, as opposed to just amending the articles, was because of some of the work of the Federalists and James Madison and getting the Anti-Federalists to agree that they wanted more out of the national government than just national defense. But we did have three main conflicts at the convention that really helped lead to this new adoption of this new Constitution. One of the primary conflicts, as you probably remember from undergrad, large state versus small states. We had some large states such as New York and Virginia and Pennsylvania, and smaller states such as New Jersey, and they were arguing about representation. They were arguing about how states should be represented in the new legislature. They were arguing about how we determine how much money each state has to pay off the debts of the new nation. Small states were very concerned that they would not be well represented in Congress. They were also very concerned that they would have to pay more than their fair share in terms of paying off these debts. So this large state, small state conflict was really one of the major conflicts at the convention that was dealt with through this Connecticut Compromise. Virginia plan was to have proportional representation in Congress. The New Jersey plan was equal representation in Congress. And so the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise, comes up with a bicameral legislature, House of Representatives, proportional representation, and a U.S. Senate with equal representation. So that's how that problem was dealt with in the Constitution. So that's kind of your first major compromise in the Constitution. Then the second major conflict was between slave states and non-slave states. One of the things that slave states wanted to do is they wanted to get the institution of slavery built into the Constitution. They thought if they could get the institution of slavery into the Constitution, that would then cement the institution of slavery, and it would be very hard to then get rid of slavery later on. Madison and others fought very hard against putting the institution of slavery into the Constitution. Hamilton and others fought very hard against that. They were successful at keeping the institution of slavery out of the Constitution, but some of the compromises that they made obviously were compromises that we paid dearly for later on. Compromises such as the 3/5 compromise in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, that enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a free person for the purposes of representation in the House, and then a prohibition against banning the slave trade until at least 1808 that was found in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. So whereas the framers dealt very effectively with the large state versus small state conflict, they were just the opposite in terms of dealing with this slave state, non-slave state type of conflict. Then the third conflict that had to be dealt with was this conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that we had referenced earlier. Federalists wanted a stronger national government. Anti-Federalists wanted power to reside with the states. So the way in which the framers dealt with this was, again, through a series of compromises. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, we get enumerated powers. And so certain powers are listed. They are given specifically to Congress. When you enumerate powers, when you list powers, you are by definition limiting them, because the implication is if a power is not listed for Congress, then that power does not belong to Congress. So by enumerating powers, you are limiting the power of Congress. This was very much a nod to the Anti-Federalists. But then at the end of Article 1, Section 8, there is the elastic clause of the Constitution, that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying the execution of the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in it by the Constitution. In other words, Congress can do anything it deems necessary and proper that will allow it to carry out those enumerated powers listed earlier on in Article 1, Section 8. So the elastic clause is a nod to the Federalists and then a great strengthening of the powers of Congress. And so again, you've got this kind of tension that's going on in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Then in Article 6, paragraph 2, you end up with this thing called the Supremacy Clause, that the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States are the supreme law of the land, meaning that when a state constitution or a state law comes into conflict with the national constitution or a national law, the national government wins. That Supremacy Clause is a very strong pronouncement of the authority and the supremacy of the national government. This was a major win for the Federalists. So much of a win for the Federalists that anti-Federalists really pushed back very hard on ratifying this new Constitution. And so when it came to ratification of the Constitution, very quickly, within a 2-year period of time, you had 10 states that ratified the Constitution. According to Article 7 of the Constitution, you only needed 9 out of 13 states to ratify for the Constitution to go into effect. Well, you got 10 states relatively quickly. The problem was you didn't have the state of New York. New York had not yet ratified the Constitution, and essentially, if the framers did not have New York, they had nothing. New York was the linchpin of trade amongst the colonies. Most of the goods that flowed into colonial America flowed in through the port of New York and were then dispersed throughout the states. If you didn't have New York, you didn't have the port of New York, then this Constitution, even though it was ratified in effect, you really did not have a nation. So the framers knew they really had to convince the anti-federalists and the citizens of New York to support this new Constitution. So the two ways in which they did it, they amended the Constitution immediately with the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And then Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay set about writing the Federalist Papers, this collection of 85 papers to defend the new Constitution and to try and allay some of the concerns of the anti-Federalists. So kind of from a literary perspective, you had these Federalist Papers that were being written to support the Constitution. And then you had another group of anti-federalists who wrote the anti-federalist papers that were meant to argue against the ratification of the Constitution, arguing the Constitution created too strong of a national government. Now, we don't talk a lot about the anti-federalist papers because to the victor go the spoils. And so the Federalists were successful at getting New York to ratify the Constitution. And so we ended up with this new national government. So since they won, in courses, we usually talk about the Federalist Papers. We don't really talk a lot about the anti-Federalist Papers. But we get these first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and then we get these Federalist Papers to try and convince New York and anti-Federalists to support the Constitution. Now, in the Bill of Rights, these first 10 amendments to the Constitution, there were actually supposed to be 12 amendments to the Constitution. 2 of those 12 amendments did not end up getting ratified. Only 10 of the 12 got ratified. 2 of those amendments that did not get ratified were supposed to be the first and the second amendment to the Constitution. One of those amendments was designed to limit the size of essentially what we know today as House districts. So districts that would then decide representation in the House, to limit the size of those House districts to 50,000 inhabitants. If we would have had that amendment ratified, it would mean that instead of having 435 seats in the House of Representatives like we have today, we'd instead today would have 4,326 seats. You can imagine how difficult it would be to get a majority vote out of 4,326 members, far more difficult than it is to get a majority of 435 members. And it's hard enough to get a majority of 435 members to agree to anything in the House of Representatives. So it's probably a good thing that that amendment did not get ratified. Then the other amendment that did not get ratified was one written by James Madison that said that members of Congress could not get a pay increase until their intervening election occurred. So they could not enjoy an increase in pay until they stood for re-election. That one, written by James Madison, again, did not get ratified as part of the Bill of Rights But eventually, over 200 years later, it did get ratified in 1992 as the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. So when these amendments were first proposed back in the late 1700s, there was not a sunset provision written into those amendments, meaning that they were still valid even 200 years later. Today, whenever a constitutional amendment is proposed, there's always a sunset provision that will typically say if this amendment is not ratified within 7 years, it then becomes null and void. Since that amendment didn't have that sunset provision, then it was still a valid amendment, and all you need to do is get the number of a requisite number, 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify it, and it would become part of the Constitution. That happened in 1992, and it then became the 27th Amendment and the final amendment currently to the Constitution. So it's a little piece of history for you. But these first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were supposed to give power to the people and to say, here are the powers that people have and the liberties that people have. So people have freedom of religion. People have freedom of press. They have freedom of speech. They have freedom to peaceably assemble. They have the right to bear arms. They have the right to not be forced to have soldiers quartered in their homes as part of this umbrella right to privacy. They have protection against unreasonable search and seizures. They have criminal justice protections, such as protections against double jeopardy, protections against self-incrimination. They have the right to a jury trial. They have the right to confront witnesses brought against them. They have the right to be indicted by a grand jury before they are held on trial. They have the right to a speedy trial. They have the right to counsel to represent them. They have the right to a jury trial in a civil case where the amount is more than $20. They have protection against excessive fines. They have protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Ninth Amendment saying that all these rights that are given to the national government, the Constitution, are not meant to deprive rights to individuals. 10th Amendment, the Reserve Powers Amendment, says that all the powers that are not given to Congress nor denied to the states then are reserved for the states and the people. So the combination of these 10 amendments are meant to provide these protections to individuals and to states to protect against an overly powerful national government. They were put there to try and convince the anti-federalists not to fear this new government and to ratify the Constitution. Then those 85 Federalist Papers, primarily written by Alexander Hamilton, about 29 of them written by James Madison, only 5 of them written by John Jay because he fell ill during the writing of the Federalist Papers. Those were also meant to advocate for the Constitution. One of those Federalist Papers that I appended to our Canvas site was Federalist Paper number 39. And I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at Federalist 39. If you have not looked at it yet, please do take a look at it because I think it's a really good microcosm of the thinking of the Federalists, such as James Madison, about how to convince the anti-Federalists to support the Constitution. So the two primary strategies that Madison used in Federalist 39 to convince anti-Federalists to support the Constitution, the first strategy he used is to tell anti-federalists this new government that we are creating is nothing that is unusual. This is a government that you are familiar with. If you look at your individual state governments, you'll see a lot of elements of your individual state government in this new national government. So for instance, he says, take a look at the terms of members of Congress. So members of the House serve 2-year terms. Members of the Senate serve 6-year terms. Those members of the House serving 2-year terms, those are very short terms. So they are going to be held accountable by the people every 2 years. Even though members of the Senate are serving longer 6-year terms, he says, take a look at your state legislatures. And in those state legislatures at the time, in a lot of states, state legislators were serving 4- and 6-year terms. So 6-year terms are not overly long, and they are certainly not unprecedented. Well, this new national government, we have this independent executive that serves a 4-year term. Well, what are you afraid of with a 4-year term? Take a look at your state. And in several states, governors actually serve 6-year terms, as opposed to the shorter 4-year term being served by a president. So he said, don't be afraid of this new government. It's nothing unusual. It's very similar, if not actually weaker, than what you currently have in your state and your state constitutions. So that's one argument he made. Then the second argument he made, which I think is the more compelling argument, is he says, let's break the Constitution down into its component elements. And he did that to try and ask the question, is the Constitution, is this new national government federal or is it national in nature? Now, the verbiage, the words that were used by the framers had different meanings to how they are used today. So a good example of that is the word federal. For us today, when we think about the word federal, we use it synonymous with that word national. So we say the national government, sometimes we say the federal government. The use of the term federal by the framers was much different. What the framers meant by the word federal was really what we mean by a confederation today. So when they used the word federal, they were really talking about more of a confederation, whereby states would retain their sovereignty. So their word federal is our word today, confederation. So when he says, is the Constitution federal or is it national? He's basically saying, is it more of a confederation where the states retain power, or is there more national where the power will be at the national level? So to answer the question, whether it's federal or national, he said, let's go to its component elements. So let's first look at the question of who created this Constitution? Who created this new union? Well, he says when you look at the Constitution is created through the ratification of the states. And even the Constitution, when it was written itself, it was written by delegates of the states. So since it's being written by delegates of the states, and the states then have the ultimate decision whether or not to ratify this Constitution, the Constitution of the Union is the result of the states. The states create the Constitution. That was a compelling argument to make to the Anti-Federalists to get them to support the Constitution. But when we look back on it, it also provided fodder for the secessionists in the Civil War to say, well, look at what Madison said. Madison said that we created the Constitution, we created this union. So if we as the states created this union, we as the states can then leave the union. And so it gave them their perceived legal basis for seceding and withdrawing from the union. So unintentionally, Madison kind of gave the argument to the secessionists that then led to the Civil War. So unfortunately, he didn't think about that then, but that did kind of give them their legal basis or their perceived legal basis for seceding. But he says it was formed by the states, so therefore it's more federal in nature. He then says, well, then let's look at the power and who has the power in this new government. Well, the power in this new government resides with the Congress. The Congress is made up of two houses through this great compromise. So we have a House of Representatives where people are directly elected by representatives directly elected by the people and serve 2-year terms. So that's kind of a little bit more national in nature because they are being directly elected by people. However, under the original Constitution, members of the Senate are not directly elected. They are selected by state legislatures. So states, you get to pick who your representatives will be in the U.S. Senate. So it's more federal in nature. So the House is more national, the Senate is more federal. So Congress is kind of a combination of a national and a federal approach. Well, how about the presidency? Once again, the presidency is a combination of a national and a federal approach. Yes, people can vote directly on the president. However, we have this thing called the Electoral College. And so the president will actually be selected by the electors. Since presidents are being selected by these electors, today we have the 538-member Electoral College, that provides more protection to smaller states because the number of electors that a state will have will be their number of representatives in the House plus 2, because every state gets 2 members of the U.S. Senate. So that really provides a little bit more of a federal as opposed to a national approach. So you kind of combine them together, and the Congress is neither wholly federal nor is it wholly national. Same thing with the president. The president is neither wholly national nor is it wholly a federal position. So it's a combination of the two. He then says, let's look at the operation of government, how the daily operations of government will be transpired, how they'll be carried out. This one, he kind of throws his hands up and says, okay, it's national, because the work of government will be done by individuals. Those individuals will be members of the federal bureaucracy. There's not really much of a role for states to play in picking those bureaucrats, and so therefore it's kind of national in nature. So he gives that one up and says that will be national. Well, how about how we amend the Constitution, how we change the Constitution? Well, how we amend the Constitution is spelled out in Article 5 of the Constitution. And there are 4 different ways in which the Constitution can be amended. The first way of amending the Constitution, and that's the way we have always used, is through a proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. So in that first approach, state legislatures will be ratifying the Constitution. So that's a federal type of an approach. It gives power to state governments. The second way in which it can be amended is when you have proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. Well, that becomes a little bit less federal in nature because it's not the state legislatures ratifying, it's the state constitutional conventions ratifying. But still, states are going to have a lot of control over who attends those constitutional conventions. Chances are there are going to be a lot of state elected officials. And so there's still some state control over ratification, even in that second approach to amendment. The third way to amend the Constitution is you have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention are then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. Well, if the states are petitioning Congress and forcing a constitutional convention, there's a state role there, and then obviously ratification is done by state legislatures. So that's a really, really federal approach to amending the Constitution. Then the fourth way to amend the Constitution, 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then those amendments that come out of that national convention are ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. Again, still a pretty pronounced role here for the state governments. So in amending the Constitution, there are both national as well as federal elements to it, but it really does kind of side much more with the federal as opposed to the national. Well, how is this Constitution ratified? It's ratified by the states. So that is a very federal approach to ratifying this Constitution for the Constitution to go into effect. So you can kind of see what Madison has done is he has really divided up the Constitution into different elements and made a compelling case that the Constitution is neither wholly national nor federal. It's a really fair combination of the two. And really, when you read between the lines, it really does favor more the federal and favor state governments as opposed to the national level. And I think that argument in Federalist 39 is a pretty compelling argument for the anti-federalists to not be afraid of this new Constitution and to understand it as pretty much as federal as it is national. And so the combination of the Bill of Rights and these Federalist Papers really helped get the ball rolling toward the state of New York ratifying the Constitution. Then the remaining states ratified it, including the 14th state of Vermont eventually, and the Constitution then goes into effect. So the Constitution that we support and defend and execute as public administrators is really very much about the balancing of power. Balancing power between different branches of government, balancing power between different levels of government. So it's all about power. Power, as we know, is a multifaceted term. If we were to come up with a very quick and easy definition of power, we would probably say something to the effect of the use of resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. So if we can use the resources at our disposal to influence someone to do something, to take an action, or to think a way they otherwise would not, then we are exercising power over that individual. John Gaventa, who I may have mentioned last week, provides us with what he calls his three faces of power. He went into a rural coal mining town in Kentucky and a rural coal mining town in Tennessee, and he looked at how these coal mine owners were exercising power over coal mine workers. How are they getting these coal mine workers to work 80-hour weeks? How are they getting them to work in dangerous mine conditions? How are they getting these coal miners to agree to be paid in tokens as opposed to being paid in money? Tokens that could only be redeemed in the general store, the one store in town that was owned by the coal mine company. How did the coal mine company exert all of this control and all this influence over these coal miners? And what he found is that there were three different types or three different faces of power. The first face of power, which I call overt power, is when one party influences someone to do something they otherwise would not do, and both parties know exactly what is happening. So if you force someone to do something, you push me out the window, we both know what's going on. You know you're pushing me. I know you're pushing me. We both know power is being exerted. That's what he calls the least dangerous type of power because both parties know exactly what is going on. The second face or type of power he calls mobilization of bias, and this is agenda setting, the ability to set the agenda. So the coal mine companies were all able to set the agenda of the Tennessee and Kentucky state legislature. They were able to keep coal mine safety legislation off of the legislature's agenda. Coal mine workers only knew that mine safety legislation was not being passed. They didn't know why, they didn't know how. So this is a more dangerous type of power because the coal miners didn't know why coal mine safety was not being passed. They just knew that there were no safety rules there to protect them. That's mobilization of bias. That's agenda setting. That's more dangerous because one party doesn't know power is being exercised. But by far the most dangerous type of power, according to Gaventa, is co-optation. And co-optation is when one party in the relationship is able to replace the opinions of the other person with their own opinions. They're able to co-opt their opinions. So what was happening here, according to John Gaventa, is the coal mine owners were able to convince the coal miners that working 80-hour weeks in very dangerous mine conditions and getting paid in tokens, all those things were actually in the best interest of the miners. And since the miners believed it was in their best interest, they were then willing to accept it. So when you're able to co-opt the opinions of others, that co-optation is the most dangerous because the coal miners did not know that their opinions were being co-opted. They ended up taking on what was in the best interest of the coal mine company and didn't realize it was the interest of the coal mine company as opposed to being in their own personal self-interest. So I think what Gaventa does is he provides us with a nice multifaceted understanding of the word power. And power is implicit in the political environment in which we do our administration. We know there really is not a separation between politics and administration, as we had talked about a couple of weeks ago. We know that politics bleeds over into administration, and we work in a political environment, and politics is very much about the exercise of power. So we as administrators have to be knowledgeable about power, what power is, how it is being exercised, because we operate within an environment where power is being exercised on a daily basis. So I'd recommend that you just kind of keep this Gaventa typology of power in mind, these three different types of power, because we are going to return to them as we go through future class sessions. And as we see examples of administrative power being used, we'll ask the question, what type of power is that? And how is that power being exercised? So I just think it's good for us to kind of have that multifaceted definition of what power truly is, because we'll return to that term again and again throughout our next several weeks together. But what is much more germane for your Canvas essay number 3 is this vertical separation of powers that we have in our Constitution, known as our system of American federalism. Federalism is not a unique term. It's not a term that is unique to America. But the way in which we practice federalism is relatively unique as compared to some other nations. Australia has a system of federalism. Nigeria has a system of federalism. You'll see federalist systems around the world, but our system is a little bit different in the way in which we do it. So the Constitution recognizes two levels of government, a national government and then a state government. And this conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was all about which level of government should have the power, which level of government should have the influence. That balance of power between national and state governments is a very dynamic balance. It's a balance that has shifted and changed over the years. And it shifts and changes depending upon the period of time that we are talking about. Again, public administration is very much a timeless yet time-bound type of discipline. So the way in which we engage in administration, the way in which we distribute power is going to depend upon the period of time that we are looking at. And it also will depend upon the topic or the issue that we are focusing on as well. Throughout our history of American federalism, we have gone through several different phases of federalism or several different eras of federalism. Now, one of the articles that you had assigned this week in the classics text was an article by D.L. Wright. D.L. Wright is one of the best known federalism scholars in the history of federalism literature. And in his article, he provides for you a little bit different of a chronology of the development of federalism than I'm going to provide for you tonight. And that is common. Different federalism scholars will break up the development of federalism into different eras. And so my approach is a little different than the approach that D.L. Wright used. But even though we use different years, even though we use different terms, the same general development of federalism is the same. Both what we're doing tonight as well as what you read in the D.L. Wright article. But the way in which I approach the development of American federalism and its application to public administration is that we've gone through several distinct eras. From the founding of the nation up to the beginning of the Civil War, we were essentially in an era of federalism that I like to call dual federalism. And a lot of scholars refer to it as dual federalism. Along the left side of the screen, you'll see the different eras of federalism chronologically throughout the development. And then on the right side of the screen, you will see three different models of federalism. Three models of federalism that are given to us by D.L. Wright. What he calls coordinate authority model, overlapping authority model, and inclusive authority model. So as you go through each of these eras on the left side of the screen, we will talk about which of these models of federalism are represented in each one of these eras. So from the founding of the nation up until the beginning of the Civil War, with the era of dual federalism, we were dealing with a model of federalism that Wright calls coordinate authority federalism. You'll see in that diagram the two spheres of influence of national government and state governments. Those two spheres are separate from each other. So the national government has its jobs and its duties and responsibilities, and state governments have their jobs, their duties, and their responsibilities. You'll notice in the coordinate authority model, the local sphere of influence is completely subsumed within the state sphere of influence. And that is, again, because local governments had no protection under the original Constitution. So national government's doing its thing, state governments are doing their thing. The difference in the spheres of influence between national and state governments in the era of dual federalism is that states were doing more. So there are more duties and responsibilities reserved for the states as opposed to the duties of the national government. So really in dual federalism, those circles would kind of be inverted in terms of size. State circle would be bigger, national government circle would be a little bit smaller. Then primarily because of the institution of slavery and the way in which Southern states use the institution of slavery within the context of states' rights, we end up with the Civil War. In the run-up to the Civil War, we had this series of compromises that were meant to try and be band-aids to stave off secession. So we had things such as the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Acts, and all those compromises throughout the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that were unsuccessful at staving off the Civil War. Southern states felt that they were being dominated by the northern states in Congress. And so whenever Congress would pass laws that affected southern states and southern economy, southern states would push back on those laws. And they pushed back primarily because they were protecting the institution of slavery, which was the primary engine, if you will, of their economic system. And so they pushed back on these national laws and kept pushing back until eventually they went to the most extreme pushback, which was secession. Then in 1861, we see South Carolina secede from the Union. We see Tennessee, and we see other states then also secede from the Union and form the Confederacy. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, this argument of states' rights within the context of slavery was obviously dead. The institution of slavery was no more. There's emancipation. And then the argument that slavery would be a valid legal concept under a states' rights perspective, that issue was then dead. Then throughout Reconstruction of the South, we saw the national government greatly expand its sphere of influence. And the national government starts adopting more and more functions that previously had been the domain of state governments. So through the period after the Civil War up to the Great Depression, we usually call that second period competitive federalism, because we saw the national and state governments competing against each other for duties and power and authority. So we saw the national government get more involved in things such as the regulation of commerce. We saw the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, in 1883, where Congress starts taking advantage of its enumerated power of regulating commerce between the states. So commerce really becomes under the control of the national government. We see the national government getting more involved in workplace safety. We see them getting more involved in food safety and food quality. We see them getting more involved in the regulation of pharmaceutical medications. So this great expansion in the power and duties of the national government competing against state governments. Since the national government, when it expanded its power, took power by definition away from state governments, this was very much an example of what's known as a zero-sum game theory. You've probably heard about zero-sum game before. In zero-sum game theory, what happens is one wins and one loses. So if one party increases their power, they by definition do so at the detriment of the other party. Then we have the stock market crash in the late 1920s and the onset of the Great Depression. FDR comes into the White House in 1933 and then begins passing his New Deal policies. And the New Deal, which was geared toward pulling states and local governments out of the depths of the Great Depression, it was all predicated upon the creation of all these national programs and all these what were called alphabet agencies. So we had all these national agencies that were being developed to implement all these new national programs. So a huge expansion of the federal government, of the national government into the economy. The way in which the national government did that under FDR was oftentimes through grants and aid. So the national government would provide grants to state governments to help pull state governments out of the throes of the Great Depression. And so sometimes this era is known as not only cooperative federalism, but fiscal federalism. Fiscal because the relationship between the different levels of government was really being defined by money. Cooperative because the national government was cooperating with states through grants and aid in order to help them deal with the Great Depression. Once we move into this cooperative federalism era, from the beginning of the FDR administration up until through the 1960s, mid-1960s, we shift our model of federalism away from coordinate authority, and we shift it more to what's called overlapping authority. And that is that model there in the middle of the screen, that Venn diagram, where you now have an overlapping of functions between national, state, and local governments. So in the middle of your diagram, those are functions that are shared by national, state, and local. Then there are some that are shared by national and state governments. some that are shared by national and local governments, some that are shared by state and local governments. And then there are still some duties that belong to the national government alone, some that belong to the state government alone, some that belong to the local government alone. That overlapping type of authority means that there's a lot of negotiation and there's a lot of bargaining that goes on throughout the era of cooperative federalism. When there is a lot of this cooperation, when there's a lot of overlapping type of authority and a lot of the creation of these networks and these governing cooperative types of relationships, it means as public administrators, there are a lot more moving parts that are involved. In dual or competitive federalism, a program would be implemented by the national government or be implemented by the state government. Now programs are sometimes implemented by all three levels of government. Oftentimes the national government does indirect administration where they provide the funding, and then the direct administration belongs to the state and the local level where they actually directly interface with citizens in the actual direct delivery of these goods and services on a daily basis. So that's kind of your overlapping authority type of model, very interdependent upon each other. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson then becomes president. When Johnson becomes president, he was a big believer in centralized decision-making. Johnson had his Great Society, his war on poverty, and his expansion of civil rights. And those are kind of his three main thrusts of his domestic agenda. And the way in which he would accomplish those is by centralizing decision-making in Washington, D.C., and then using creative tools to get state and local governments to come into compliance with those national objectives. So we saw things such as categorical grants, and some of you may work with categorical grants, very specific grants of federal money where the money may only be used for specific types of purposes, and there are a lot of accountability mechanisms built in, a lot of audits that need to be done to ensure the state and local governments are carrying out these programs and spending this money in the way in which the national government wants. Then we also saw the use of mandates. And mandates are these orders where the national government will order a state or local government to take a certain type of action under the threat of civil or criminal penalty. A lot of these mandates in the Johnson administration were what we call direct order mandates, where the national government would directly order state and local governments to take certain types of actions. You think about desegregation in the South, and where you would have troops that were sent in to make sure that schools were desegregated, oftentimes over the objections of governors like George Wallace in Alabama and local government officials. It was very much a direct order that these schools would be desegregated. So it's a very top-down type of an approach. In this era of creative federalism in the Johnson administration, the model of federalism was the third one on the screen there on the right, inclusive authority model, whereby local government authority is subsumed within state authority and state authority is subsumed within national authority. That's a very centralized top-down relationship between the different levels of government. So as an administrator, your responsiveness would have to be primarily to the national government because the national government sets all the rules, the national government makes all the administrative requirements, and so you'd be responsive to national administrative rules as opposed to perhaps state and local rules. Then when Richard Nixon comes into the White House in 1969, he ushers in with him his new approach to federalism, which is going to be known as New Federalism. Federalism scholars are not terribly creative in how they name eras, and so this is called New Federalism. And this New Federalism was predicated upon what's known as the 3 Ds of federalism, 3 words that all begin with D. Decentralization. Decentralization meant that Nixon wanted to provide local governments a seat at the decision-making table. The argument in New Federalism is who knows what's in the best interests of citizens than governments that are located most closely to those citizens. So local governments should know better the wants, needs, and desires of citizens than state governments. State governments will know better than the national government. So we decentralize decision-making. Once we've decentralized decision-making, we then engage in the second D, which is called devolution. Now, putting all this in text yet. So devolution. Devolution means turning over power and authority to those local governments to give them the authority to carry out the decisions that they have made. So decentralization is allowing them to make decisions. Then devolution is providing them with the power and the resources to actually carry out those decisions. Then the third D is deregulation. Remove some of these onerous regulations from state governments and local governments, as well as from private businesses, to free them up to be more creative and entrepreneurial and innovative. So in new federalism, it was very much turning over the authority to state and local governments, as opposed to making decisions at the national level, as was the case in creative federalism. Then after a small hiatus with the Carter administration for 4 years in the late 1970s, when Ronald Reagan comes into office in 1981, he then revives, if you will, he reinvigorates Nixon's new federalism. And so throughout the Reagan administration and the George H.W. Bush administration, we had very much this focus on decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. So providing this authority to state and local governments. With the advent of the Clinton administration in 1993, in my take on federalism, we kind of move into the current system of federalism, which is known as contextual federalism. Now, in our modern era of federalism, the decision about which level of government has the authority and power will oftentimes depend upon the context of the issue. It will depend upon the issue itself. So is it an issue that deals with, for example, the Clinton administration, welfare? So we have this major piece of legislation in 1996 called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as welfare reform. Welfare reform was a decentralization of decisions in welfare, giving power over making decisions back to state and local governments. That was something done by a Republican-controlled Congress and President Clinton, who was kind of a centrist Democratic president. So when it came to welfare, it was okay in the Clinton administration to decentralize and devolve decision-making down to state and local governments. So instead of using very specific categorical grants, in welfare reform, we transformed them into block grants. And those block grants then gave a lot more flexibility to states to determine how they would go about moving people from welfare to work. The ultimate goal of welfare reform was to lower the number of people on welfare and move them into gainful employment. How you do that was pretty much left up to state governments. So if states wanted to do that by spending money on computer literacy programs, spending money on job training programs, spending money on childcare programs, how they want to spend the money was okay with the national government, as long as the spending of that money resulted in moving people from welfare to work. So in that instance, for that issue, you saw a very decentralizing approach approved of by the Clinton administration. On other issues, though, it was much more centralizing. So you take an issue such as the laws that govern drunk driving. So we have blood alcohol content levels that will determine whether or not someone is subject to being arrested for drunk driving. At the time in the 1990s, different states had different blood alcohol content levels. Some states had a 0.08 level, some states had a 0.10 level, some had a 0.12 level. Clinton administration wanted to centralize that. They want to have one national blood alcohol content standard, and that standard would be 0.08. In order to get states to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level, he couldn't rely upon the Constitution. There's obviously no provision in the Constitution giving Congress and the national government the authority to dictate blood alcohol content levels. So instead, what he did is he threatened states and said, if you do not adopt a new state law of a 0.08 blood alcohol content level, we are going to remove federal highway funds from you. So you're going to lose federal money that will help you construct and reconstruct your highways. That is what's called a crossover type of mandate. If you don't do what we want you to do in this area, we're going to then take money away from you in this area. Those crossover mandates were successful at getting all states to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. So for that issue, he was very centralizing. For the issue of welfare reform, very decentralizing. It was contextual. It depended upon the issue. We see a similar thing in the George W. Bush administration, where in the George W. Bush administration, we had a situation where most of his policies tended to be more decentralizing, kind of in alignment with new federalism. But in terms of K through 12 education, it was much more centralizing. We had his support for the No Child Left Behind Act, which established these national proficiency standards, and states had to meet these proficiency standards, or they would end up being penalized with loss of federal education money. So for education, it was very centralizing. For most other issues, decentralizing. So I think the moral of the story in our modern system of federalism is it's very contextual. Rather than being able to guess how an administration is going to act based upon their ideology, whether they're liberal or conservative, because in the past, liberal presidents were much more in alignment with centralization. Conservative presidents were much more in alignment with decentralization. Today, it's not as much ideological as it is issue-based. And we've kind of seen that in the Biden and the Trump administrations as well. Even though the Trump administration certainly was geared much more toward decentralization and states' rights and leaving things to the states, there were some instances, such as immigration, where the national government was willing to go to court against states to enforce national immigration laws. And so it was very much of a centralizing approach in that type of an issue. So I think that's really what the tenor, if you will, of our modern system of federalism is. But this discussion of federalism, separation of powers, and our system of American government, what does it mean for public administration? As I told you 2 weeks ago in our first class, my favorite answer is always, it depends. My favorite question is, so what? So here is our big so what question. Well, so what? What does the past hour of our discussion of America, hour and a half of our discussion of America mean for public administration? For us as public administrators, it means that we serve many masters. We serve an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary in terms of separation of powers, and we serve federal government, state governments, and local governments in terms of our vertical separation and our system of federalism. Serving many masters means that we are faced with a lot of conflicting direction. Sometimes the national government will tell us one thing, and other times the state government will tell us something else. So for instance, in terms of fuel emission standards, state government in the Trump administration, the California state government said one thing in terms of tightening up on federal emission standards, making them much stricter. Then we had the Trump administration coming in saying, we're going to penalize you if you are too strict with your fuel emission standards. So we've got those conflicting types of direction. We see that sometimes, again, in environmental policy in terms of things like air quality and water quality, where there'll be one national standard and then there'll be a different state standard. So we have a lot of conflicting direction that we have to deal with as administrators. So if we are dealing with a policy that flows from the national to the state to the local level, there may be national rules that are established in the administrative rulemaking process, and then there can be state rules that are established in the state administrative rulemaking process, and they can certainly conflict with each other. So a lot of conflicting direction. Also, having this separation of powers and this system of federalism creates for us a very complex network of cooperation and competition. As we will pick up on in a future week, we'll talk a lot about collaboration. We'll talk a lot about governing networks. These networks that are created because of separation of powers, because of federalism, are very complex in nature. So we have to balance the needs and desires of different agencies and different administrators and different constituents in the implementation of these policies and programs. It is relatively unusual to have one singular agency at one single level of government that handles all the implementation of a given policy or a given program. So it creates this unique context, this unique environment of public administration. The environment of public administration is a very political environment. The worlds of politics and administration overlap with each other and bleed over onto each other. As John Gauss tells us, to understand public administration, to understand why a public organization does what it does, why public administrators behave in the way in which they behave, we must understand the ecology, the environment that surrounds them. And only by understanding that environment can we then understand public administration. That's why in a future class, we're going to return to this issue of the environment of public administration and really break down that environment in terms of who are the relevant stakeholders, who are the primary, secondary, and tertiary stakeholders, and what impact do those environmental stakeholders have on our jobs on a daily basis as public administrators. But hopefully this presentation has provided you with a refresher on some of the basics of American government. So moving forward in future class sessions, we can see really where public administration then fits within this political environment of American government. So that's our information for this evening. Do you have any comments or any questions on any of this information that we have covered over the past 2 hours and 40 minutes? See, Susanna says, I'm unclear about the principal contrast between Dillon's rule and home rule doctrine, which is a great point. No, it grants greater autonomy and decision-making power to local governments, but in what context? The line is unclear. That's a great point. So Dillon's rule basically says that local governments are creatures of the state. States can determine what types of powers they want to provide to local governments. Home rule is when the state provides the more flexibility and more autonomy to local governments in terms of a broad range of functions. So for instance, if you are a home rule government, so if you are a charter government, you will have the ability to determine things such as your elections. So you can determine how you hold your elections. You have more flexibility in determining whether you're a weak mayor or a strong mayor form of government, because that will be written into your city charter. And that city charter is essentially, for lack of a better term, your city constitution. So if you meet certain size, certain population density requirements that are spelled out in the state constitution, you'll be able to become a charter city, and that will then provide you with those home rule powers over things like your elections, can provide you more flexibility in terms of budgeting, how you put your budget together, how you spend your money, some of the details in terms of the types of audits you use and the frequency of those audits you use, the types of fund-based accounting that you use. So a lot of those budgeting types of specifics are left up to the city if it is a charter city, if it has those types of home rule provisions. But the decision about which cities can be charter cities, which cities have those home rule powers, that should then be incorporated within the state constitution. So it's still a power that is coming from the state government in the state constitution. So local governments under Dillon's rule are still subsumed within the state government. The flexibility and autonomy that they have will come to them from the state government. So some cities that are charter cities that have a city charter will be able to specify those types of functions, as opposed to other cities that do not have those home rule authorities, and they are then more under the authority of the state government. That applies to what we refer to as general purpose governments. And this is an important point that I think we should emphasize. In terms of local governments, there are some governments that are considered general purpose governments and other governments that are considered special purpose governments. And I think we may have made mention of this our last time together. But general purpose governments are governments such as cities and counties. They provide a lot of different functions across a lot of different policy areas. So a general purpose government such as a city, if it meets the constitutional requirements, can become a charter city and then gain some of these home rule powers, some of this flexibility and autonomy. Special purpose governments are governments such as school districts, sewer and water districts, they're special purpose because they only provide services in one given special policy area. They are much more limited in the power that they have. They cannot apply to be charter governments. They don't have those home rule powers. They are much more under control of the county and under state. And so, giving an example, I served for several years on a school board. And when I was on the school board, we, as a school board, we were a special purpose government. And it was kind of difficult for me during the COVID pandemic to make this clear to a lot of our citizens. We had citizens who were coming to board meetings. They were unhappy with remote schooling. They were unhappy with masking requirements. And so they wanted us as a school board to get rid of those get rid of those masking requirements, get rid of that remote instruction. And we would have to tell them, we cannot do that because we are not a general purpose. We're a special purpose government. And as a special purpose government, we are under the auspices of the county. So we are accountable to the County Office of Education. We are accountable to the county's education superintendent. We are accountable to the county health department. So a lot of those masking requirements from the county health department, those are coming from the county health department. We as a special purpose government, we are required to follow those requirements, and we didn't have any flexibility to change those requirements. As a point of great frustration and consternation among many of our members of the community, because we were a special purpose government and we didn't have the ability to make those types of decisions. Another example is whenever the California Voting Rights Act, whenever we shifted our elections to district-based as opposed to at-large, whenever we shifted from odd year elections to even year elections, we couldn't do that on our own. So we passed a resolution to do that. That resolution had to be reviewed and approved by Dean Logan, by his office as the county registrar and recorder. Also, it had to be approved by the County Office of Education, and it also had to be approved by the county County Committee on School District Reorganization. So it was an actual county committee that had to review that and approve it before we could go about becoming district-based elections as well as moving to even year elections. And so it's just an example of how special purpose governments are a little different than general purpose governments. See, Ashley says, I can really see how it applies to my job within the county. It's very important to understand the role of government when you're working in the bureaucracy. I agree. I mean, you need to know the role of government. You need to know different types of government, because the type of government you work in will actually have a big impact upon what you can and what you cannot do in your positions. And as someone who has 6 years experience in a special purpose government, I'll tell you, it can be very frustrating. You want to respond to your constituents, but you can't because your hands are tied. And there literally is nothing that you can do in terms of acceding to their commands or acceding to their demands. So it can be very frustrating. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't really have that requisite knowledge of American government and the different types of governments that we have in this country. Yes, we have one national government, we have 50 state governments, but we literally have tens of thousands of local governments. And then overlay on top of these general and special purpose governments, overlay on top of that, public authorities. And so we have these joint power authorities here in California, these JPAs that are created for a variety of different reasons, oftentimes created to issue debt. And citizens really don't have very much of information at all about those JPAs, what they are, who sits on those JPA boards, and what those JPAs do. For a couple of years, I was the president of a joint finance authority. And I know that no one ever came to our meetings, even though we were publicly advertised them. No one really had any comments for our meetings because people really didn't know what we were. But we were really managing hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of bonds. And we actually had one bond that we were funded that saved, which is refinancing, which saved voters in our area, saved citizens in our area, $850,000. That's a big savings. It's almost $1 million in savings to voters, but they didn't even know about it because we were a joint finance authority. We weren't a traditional type of government. Jeremy said, worked in both general and special purpose government agencies. A lot of the regulation and administration policies can differ like night and day, and it's true. The regulations you deal with in a special purpose government compared to a general purpose government are oftentimes completely different from each other. It's kind of a learning curve when you move from a special purpose to a general purpose or vice versa. Those are all very good comments. And, hopefully Through civic education, people will learn more about our system of government and the different types of governments that we have. I know most of you in this class, you're very familiar with American government and working in government. You know the different types of government, but it can really have a very profound impact upon what we do and how we do it as public administrators. And so that's why this discussion tonight, kind of foundational information, so that we're all kind of on the same playing field then moving forward as we get into more of the discrete elements of being a public administrator in the field of public administration. And so then next week, we're going to move into more of a discussion of accountability and ethics. And we'll talk more about how we hold public administrators accountable for their actions, some of the reasons why we need these heightened accountability standards. We'll do some breakout groups as well next week, because I know I've been talking to you a lot over our last 2 nights together, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit less. And so I think what we'll do next week is in the first half of class, we'll present the information on accountability and ethics. Then after our break, we'll do some breakout groups. I know we're a very large group, which means we may have to break up into 6 or 7 different groups. But we'll do some breakout group work dealing with accountability and ethics, then reconvene near the end of the class, see what each group came up with, and kind of give you an opportunity to work amongst yourselves rather than having to sit and listen to me for almost 3 hours. One last thing in text chat, compliance and policies can be driven by source of funding, federal versus state funding in education. Absolutely true. You know, the policies that we have to adhere to will depend upon where that money is coming from. And one of the unfortunate things in education, I won't get on my soapbox too much here, is that local school districts are certainly held accountable for being compliant with federal regulations, especially in terms of special education. However, the reimbursement that local school districts get from the federal government for special education spending is only a fraction of what that special education spending actually costs. There's something we refer to at the local school district level as special education bleed. And that's when expenses from the special education program bleed over into the general fund. And we have to use general fund revenue in order to pay for these special education programs. And that's because the federal government every year will reimburse us somewhere between about 20 and 40% of the actual costs of these special education programs. Special education funding is something that certainly needs to be done and needs to be done to service these students, but the federal government usually doesn't uphold its end of the bargain in terms of funding those types of programs. But those are policies that need to be adhered to, even though the funding is not there. They almost become unfunded or partially funded mandates from the federal government. So that's an excellent point. Okay, we are bumping up against 9 o'clock. And so I think we've done some pretty good work tonight. I don't want to keep you here past time. So what we'll do then again for next week, we'll get into accountability and ethics. For your Canvas essay number 3, you're going to take some of this information we talked about with our development of American federalism and then apply it to the work of public administration. So selecting an issue, illustrate how our federal system impacts the work of a public administrator and how it's kind of different doing that work here in a system of American federalism as it would have been in a more unitary system that does not have federalism. And so use this information then for Canvas Essay 3, your initial post by Thursday, and then your responses after that. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. I'll get this recording up on our Canvas site by tomorrow morning, and look forward to reading Canvas Essay number 3, and we'll be back at it then at 6 o'clock next Monday. Have a great week. Have a great
Thanks,
weekend.
Professor.
Talk to you soon. Thank you very much. Have a good night.